A loyal dog refuses to leave the collapsed entrance of an abandoned mine, barking into the rubble as if begging for someone to listen. When a weary veteran arrives, he senses something strange, a tension in the air that feels too familiar. Curious, he crawls closer, and in the silence, he hears it. Faint metallic sounds and broken voices calling from the darkness. In that moment, he realizes lives are still trapped inside, and the mountain is daring him to act. What follows is a rescue no one could have imagined. A story of loyalty, courage, and survival against impossible odds. The morning sun poured across the Appalachian hills, painting the fading autumn leaves in shades of gold and rust. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth. On most days, this part of the mountain was quiet, disturbed only by the chatter of woodpeckers or the trickle of a hidden stream. But today, the silence was shattered by the urgent, echoing barks of a dog. It was a large shepherd mix, about 7 years old, his coat a rugged blend of gray and tan, with streaks of black around the muzzle. His paws were raw, bleeding slightly as he scratched furiously at the pile of rock and dirt that sealed the entrance of an abandoned mine. His tail whipped back and forth with restless urgency, his voice hoarse from barking. Any passerby might have dismissed him as a stray gone wild, but his eyes told a different story. Wide, unyielding, filled with both fear and pleading, the dog seemed to be begging for help. This mine had been abandoned for decades, ever since a tragic collapse killed several workers inside. Locals considered it cursed, a place where only fools dared to wander. Yet the dog would not leave. He circled, whined, then barked again toward the black crack in the earth. And if anyone came close, he would rush forward, then sprint back to the rubble as if trying to pull them along, demanding they listen. Half a mile up the mountain, in a weathered wooden cabin, lived Walter Harris, a man who had seen more than his share of darkness. Walter was in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, though a limp in his left leg betrayed an old war injury. His face was sun-baked and lined with years of hardship. A peppering of gray stubble covered his jaw, and his steel blue eyes carried the weight of memories he rarely spoke of. Memories from deserts far away, where he had once fought and lost friends. After leaving the military, Walter chose solitude. Hunting, fishing, and the rhythm of the woods gave him the peace he never found in cities. But a soldier's instincts never truly fade. Even in silence, his senses stayed alert, always scanning, always listening for what others might overlook. That morning, as he checked his traps along a narrow ridge, Walter paused. From somewhere down below, the sharp cry of a dog rang out. At first he ignored it. Wild dogs were not uncommon here. But the sound persisted, louder, sharper, filled with a kind of desperation that gnawed at him. He frowned, adjusting the strap of his old canvas pack, and began moving downhill. When he reached the clearing, he saw the animal immediately. The shepherd was clawing at the collapsed entrance of the mine, his body shaking with exhaustion, but refusing to stop. Dust clung to his fur. Blood streaked his paws. When the dog spotted Walter, he bounded forward, barking frantically. Then he spun and dashed back to the rubble, looking over his shoulder to be sure the man was following. Walter set his pack down, crouching. "What in God's name are you trying to tell me, boy?" he muttered. The dog whined, tail thrashing, before returning to the rubble and digging harder. Curious now, Walter limped closer to the jagged pile of stone. The mine entrance had nearly vanished, but a small gap remained, a dark slit no wider than his shoulders. He leaned down, pressed his ear to the opening, and froze. From within the suffocating dark, something tapped, a faint metallic rhythm. Clang, clang, clang. His eyes widened. That wasn't the sound of falling rock. It was deliberate. Someone was inside. He drew back sharply, staring at the rubble, then at the dog, who stood panting, eyes locked on him. Walter's chest tightened. Memories surged, of voices crying for help in distant bunkers, of men trapped beyond reach. His throat felt dry, but one thought burned through the shock. Someone's alive in there. The veteran's jaw clenched. Without hesitation, he unbuckled his pack. From inside, he pulled a folding knife, a flashlight, and a coil of rope. His fingers trembled slightly as he worked, not from fear, but from urgency. He knew the risks: unstable rock, poisonous air, the possibility that one wrong move could bring the rest of the mountain down. But leaving was not an option. Beside him, the dog barked again, pacing in frantic circles, then stopped and stared, waiting. Walter knelt, resting one hand on the animal's head. Its ears twitched, body still quivering with tension. "All right, partner," he whispered, voice gravelly. "I'll go in, but you stay here. If I don't come back out, find someone else." The shepherd let out a low, mournful whine, pressing its head into Walter's hand. For a moment, man and dog locked eyes, two souls bound by an unspoken understanding. Walter sucked in a deep breath, pressed his shoulder against the rocks, and began to worm his way through the jagged opening. His flashlight beam cut a pale arc through the blackness as he disappeared into the mine. Behind him, the daylight shrank to a thin slice, and the dog lowered itself to the ground, waiting faithfully, never taking its eyes off the hole. Inside, Walter could already hear the sound again, faint voices, broken and weak, drifting up from the depths. And though he did not yet know it, this was only the beginning of a rescue that would defy all expectation. The air inside the collapsed mine was colder than Walter expected. The moment he pushed through the narrow gap, a draft of damp earth and metal swept across his face, chilling the sweat on his brow. The beam of his flashlight carved a narrow cone of light through the blackness, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air, like tiny, restless ghosts. Behind him, the daylight shrank until it was just a thin sliver, and the muffled whine of the dog grew faint. Walter's body ached as he crawled forward on elbows and knees, his bad leg dragging awkwardly behind. Every scrape of rock beneath his boots echoed far too loudly, making him acutely aware of how fragile this tunnel was. If the wrong stone shifted, the entire ceiling could come down. Still, he pressed on, following the sound that had first drawn him here, the faint, deliberate tapping. It came again. Clang, clang, clang. But this time, mixed within the hollow rhythm, he caught something else. A voice. Weak. Strained. "Help." Walter froze, pressing his ear to the damp wall. Yes, he was sure now. There were people still alive. His pulse quickened. He adjusted the flashlight, sweeping it across the tunnel ahead. The shaft narrowed in places, forcing him to crawl on his stomach. In others, the ground sloped downward, slick with moisture, threatening to send him sliding deeper into darkness. He moved carefully, every muscle tense, mind racing back to his years overseas. The claustrophobic tunnels were not unlike the bunkers and basements he'd been forced to search during combat, always expecting an ambush, always alert for traps. Only this time, there were no enemies. Just time, rock, and fragile human breath. After several agonizing minutes, Walter reached a wider chamber where the ceiling rose enough for him to crouch. He shone the beam across the ground, and his chest tightened. A shattered helmet lay in the dirt, its surface smeared with dried blood. Nearby, a bent shovel rested half buried in rubble. The dust told the story clearly. A collapse had sealed this chamber off, trapping whoever was inside. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. He knelt, examining the floor. Fresh scuff marks. Someone had been moving, scraping against stone, leaving faint trails in the dust. And then, from deeper in the chamber, the sound came again. A cough, ragged and wet, followed by words. Hoarse, barely audible. "Is someone there?" Walter swung the flashlight toward the voice. At first, all he saw was broken rock. Then a face emerged from the shadows. A young man, maybe in his 20s, his skin caked with coal dust, lips cracked, eyes wide with disbelief. He was pinned awkwardly against the wall, one leg trapped beneath a slab of stone. Walter's gut clenched. He moved quickly, kneeling beside him. "Easy, son. You're not alone anymore," he said, voice steady. The young man blinked against the light. His voice cracked. "I thought nobody would come." Walter reached into his pack, pulling out a canteen. He tipped it carefully against the miner's lips. The boy drank greedily, coughing as water trickled down his chin. Walter steadied him, letting him sip just enough. "Slow down. There's more where that came from," he murmured. "Name's Caleb," the miner whispered. "Walter," the veteran replied. "Now let's get you out of here." He examined the stone pinning Caleb's leg. It was heavy, jagged, but not immovable. Walter wedged his knife under the edge, testing its give. The rock shifted slightly, sending a small shower of dust to the ground. Caleb winced in pain. "Sorry, son," Walter muttered. He paused, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. This wasn't going to be easy. He needed leverage. Rope wouldn't help much here, but maybe he could use one of the broken beams lying across the floor. He dragged a rotting wooden support closer, jamming it under the rock. Using all the strength in his arms and shoulders, Walter pushed downward, forcing the beam into a crude lever. The stone budged, just an inch, then another. Caleb groaned, his face contorting as blood rushed back into his crushed leg. "Almost there. Hold on," Walter grunted, his muscles trembling. With a final heave, the rock rolled just far enough for him to pull Caleb free. The miner collapsed onto the ground, gasping, clutching his thigh. Walter knelt beside him, quickly checking the leg. It was swollen, bleeding, but not broken beyond hope. The boy could still walk, if he had help. Walter tied a strip of cloth tightly around the wound to slow the bleeding. His hands moved with practiced precision. This wasn't his first time improvising under pressure. Caleb looked at him with wide, grateful eyes. "I thought I was dead." Walter gave a tight, grim smile. "Not today." But as he spoke, another sound drifted through the tunnel. A different voice, fainter, from deeper still. "Caleb." Both men turned their heads. Walter's heart lurched. There was more than one survivor. Caleb's eyes filled with tears. "That's Daniel. My brother. He was with me when it collapsed. Please, you have to get him." Walter steadied the flashlight, aiming it toward the narrow passage at the back of the chamber. The air seemed thicker there, heavy with dust. He could already taste the grit on his tongue, feel it in his lungs. Going deeper meant more danger, more risk of another collapse. But he couldn't stop now. He clasped Caleb's shoulder. "Stay here. Conserve your strength. I'll find him." Caleb grabbed his arm, desperation in his grip. "Please, don't leave him." Walter nodded firmly, prying himself free. He set his rope beside Caleb. "If anything happens, tie that around your waist. I'll haul you if I have to." Then he turned and crawled toward the narrow passage, his flashlight beam cutting into the shadows. The mine groaned faintly overhead, a reminder of how unstable it was. Each movement sent rocks skittering across the floor. Walter's breath came slow and measured, but his pulse pounded in his ears. He thought briefly of the dog waiting outside. That animal had known. Somehow, it had understood that lives were still inside, that someone needed to hear them. Without the dog, he would never have come. Deeper into the tunnel, the voice came again. Help! This time weaker, almost swallowed by the earth. Walter pushed on, scraping his knees raw against stone until the passage widened just enough to reveal another figure. Daniel, slighter than Caleb, with sandy hair streaked black by coal, lay half buried in rubble. His chest rose shallowly, but his eyes fluttered open at the light. Walter rushed forward, dropping to his knees. I've got you, son. Hold on. Daniel's lips moved, his voice no more than a whisper. Don't. Leave us. Walter's throat tightened. I'm not leaving anyone. He set to work again, pulling rock after rock, ignoring the ache in his muscles, ignoring the sweat burning his eyes. The ceiling above creaked ominously, but he pressed harder, faster. Each piece of rubble thrown aside felt like a battle won. Until finally, Daniel was free enough for Walter to pull him into his arms. The boy sagged against him, trembling, but alive. Walter adjusted his grip, slinging Daniel partly over his shoulder. He could carry him, but it would be slow. Caleb was still waiting, injured. They had to move carefully, because one more tremor could seal them all inside forever. Walter drew in a breath, steadying himself. The mission wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. Walter's arms trembled as he shifted Daniel's limp frame into a more secure hold. The young miner was barely conscious, his breath shallow, but he was alive. That was enough to keep Walter moving. The beam of his flashlight danced across the jagged tunnel as he turned back toward the chamber where Caleb waited. Each step sent pain shooting through his injured leg, but he ground his teeth and forced himself onward. When he reached the chamber, Caleb's eyes widened with relief. You found him. His voice cracked, equal parts joy and agony. He tried to push himself upright, but the pain in his leg forced him back down with a groan. Stay put, Walter ordered firmly. He lowered Daniel gently beside his brother, propping him against a stone wall. Both young men looked fragile, coated in grime, and streaked with blood, but the faint rise and fall of their chests gave Walter hope. He passed the canteen again, letting Daniel sip just enough water to wet his lips. Thank you, Caleb whispered, tears cutting pale lines through the soot on his face. Walter nodded once, not trusting his voice. In moments like this, gratitude felt too heavy. He wasn't a savior, just a man who happened to be there when fate demanded it. Still, seeing the brothers together sparked something inside him, a fire that reminded him why he couldn't stop now. But their ordeal was far from over. Getting in had been hard. Getting out with two injured men would be exponentially harder. The path was narrow, dangerous, and unstable. Walter scanned the tunnel walls, listening. Every minute, he heard faint pops and cracks, the mountain shifting under its own weight, reminding him their time was limited. He crouched low, speaking quietly. Listen, boys. We're going to get out, but you'll need to trust me and do exactly as I say. Understand? Both nodded weakly. Walter retrieved the coil of rope he had left with Caleb. He looped it carefully around Daniel's torso, tying secure knots with practiced efficiency. I'll drag him if I have to, he explained. Then he cut another length and tied it around Caleb's waist, giving him just enough slack to crawl while Walter pulled from ahead. The veteran leaned back on his heels, flashlight clutched tight. His pulse hammered in his ears. He had done extractions before, in deserts, in ruined towns, hauling wounded brothers in arms through places no sane man would linger. The mechanics were the same. The stakes were the same. The only difference was the enemy. This time, the enemy was the mountain itself. Stay low. Don't stop unless I tell you, Walter instructed. Then he took the lead, easing into the narrow tunnel with the ropes taut behind him. The first few yards went smoothly. Walter pulled Daniel carefully while Caleb crawled, gritting his teeth against the pain in his leg. But soon, the mine began to resist their escape. A low groan rippled through the walls, followed by a cascade of pebbles raining down. Dust filled the air, making them cough violently. "Keep moving," Walter barked, dragging harder. His injured leg screamed, but he ignored it. They reached the section where the ceiling dipped so low, Walter had been forced to crawl on his stomach earlier. Now, with Daniel in tow, the space felt impossibly tight. He shoved forward, dragging the unconscious boy inch by inch, while Caleb pushed from behind. The walls seemed to close in, pressing on Walter's chest, stealing his breath. His flashlight flickered. For a terrifying second, the tunnel plunged into near blackness before the beam steadied again. Walter muttered under his breath, "Not now. Don't you die on me." The air grew staler, heavy with the stench of damp stone and coal. Walter's lungs burned. He paused, sucking in what little oxygen he could, and forced himself onward. His body screamed for rest, but the sounds around him, Caleb's ragged breaths, Daniel's faint moans, the ominous creaks of the collapsing mine, pushed him forward. At last they cleared the tight passage and stumbled back into a wider stretch. Walter collapsed briefly to his knees, sweat dripping from his brow, his arms trembling. But there was no time to rest. He flicked the flashlight ahead and saw the faint outline of the collapsed entrance in the distance. Beyond that rubble was sunlight, fresh air, and the dog. A sudden crash split the silence. Rocks tumbled from the ceiling, slamming onto the ground just feet from where they sat. Caleb yelped in fear, shielding his head. Walter shoved both boys toward the wall, shielding them with his own body until the shower of debris subsided. Dust choked the chamber, and Walter's chest heaved as he realized how close they had come to being buried alive. "We have to move faster," he growled, his voice hoarse. "This whole place is coming down." But moving faster meant risk. Dragging Daniel too quickly could injure him worse, and Caleb's leg might give out entirely. Walter's mind spun, calculating. He had rope, he had muscle, he had will, and above all, he had no choice. They pressed on, crawling, dragging, pulling with every ounce of strength. The tunnel seemed longer now, each yard stretched by the weight of fear. Walter's back ached, his knee burned, but he refused to yield. Then, faintly, he heard it, the sound of barking, muffled but distinct. The shepherd dog was still waiting. The sound cut through Walter's exhaustion like a blade, fueling him with renewed determination. "You hear that?" he rasped to Caleb. "That's your way out. Don't you give up." Caleb managed a broken smile, his eyes wet. "That dog, he saved us." Walter didn't respond. He couldn't afford words. He pulled harder. Finally, the rubble blocking the entrance loomed ahead. The gap he had squeezed through before was still there, but now it looked smaller, tighter. Maybe the rocks had shifted. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on him. Either way, it was their only chance. Walter untied Daniel's rope, slinging the boy across his shoulders in a fireman's carry. He grunted, teeth gritted against the strain, and gestured for Caleb to crawl behind him. Slowly, painfully, Walter forced his way toward the light. The gap scraped his shoulders, tore at his arms. His lungs burned as dust clogged his throat. But then, air. Fresh, cool, blessed air. With one last heave, Walter pushed Daniel through the gap and collapsed into the sunlight. He lay there, gasping, chest heaving, until the familiar sound of barking erupted beside him. The dog had rushed forward, tail thrashing wildly, licking Daniel's dirt-smeared face as if urging him awake. Walter rolled onto his back, staring up at the blue sky. For a moment, he let himself believe it was over, but then a realization struck him like a hammer. Caleb was still inside. He jerked upright, spinning toward the entrance. Dust billowed from the gap, and faintly he heard the boy's voice cry out, "Walter!" The mind groaned again, louder this time, a deep rumble that shook the ground beneath his knees. Walter's stomach turned to ice. The mountain wasn't done. It was about to bury them all. He lunged forward, ready to dive back into the collapsing darkness. Walter shoved rocks aside with frantic urgency, his hands raw and bleeding. The entrance had shifted during the last tremor, narrowing the passage he had crawled through earlier. Dust poured out of the cracks, choking him, stinging his eyes. Behind him, the dog barked madly, sensing the danger, as if urging him not to give up. "Caleb!" Walter shouted into the darkness. His voice echoed, muffled by stone and earth. From inside came a desperate reply. "I can't! My leg!" Walter's heart hammered. The boy was alive, but pinned again. He had only seconds before another collapse sealed the mine forever. He thrust his flashlight between the rocks, peering into the shadows. A glimpse of movement. Caleb's arm, clawing at the rubble. Without hesitation, Walter dropped to his stomach, forcing his broad shoulders through the gap. The edges tore at his shirt, scraped his skin, but he pushed harder. His bad knee screamed with pain, but pain meant nothing now. He could see Caleb's wide, terrified eyes reflecting the faint light. "Hold on, son. I'm coming," Walter growled, voice low and commanding. He wriggled through and dragged himself to Caleb's side. The boy was pinned under a heavy beam that had collapsed from the ceiling. His face was pale beneath the coal dust, sweat streaking down, lips trembling. Don't leave me," Caleb whispered. Walter gripped his shoulder firmly. "I am not leaving anyone, not while I'm breathing." The veteran sized up the beam, too heavy to lift barehanded. He glanced around, his flashlight sweeping across shattered planks and jagged stones. No leverage points, no tools, just his will and the rope. He looped the rope around the beam, bracing the other end against a protruding rock, creating a crude pulley. "Listen to me," Walter said firmly, locking eyes with the boy. "When I pull, you push with everything you've got. I don't care how much it hurts. We get one shot at this, you hear me?" Caleb nodded weakly, tears spilling down his dirt-streaked cheeks. "I'll try." Walter planted his boots, ignoring the searing pain in his knee. With a grunt, he heaved on the rope, muscles straining, veins bulging at his neck. The beam resisted, groaning as if mocking him. He pulled harder, his vision blurring at the edges, his body trembling under the effort. "Push! Damn it!" Walter roared. Caleb screamed in agony as he forced his body to move, shoving against the stone that pinned him. The beam shifted, just an inch, but enough. Walter gave one last desperate pull, and the beam rolled aside with a thunderous crash. Caleb collapsed forward, gasping, clutching at Walter's arm. The veteran hauled him upright, slinging the boy's arm over his own shoulders. Dust rained from above as the tunnel groaned dangerously. "We're not done yet. Move!" Walter barked. Together they staggered toward the entrance. Every step was a battle. Caleb's injured leg dragged, his weight heavy against Walter's battered frame. The rope dug into Walter's calloused hands, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as the ground quaked beneath them. At last, the faint glow of daylight pierced the gloom ahead. Walter's heart surged. Salvation was within reach. He shoved Caleb forward, forcing him through the gap. Strong jaws clamped on the rope outside, the dog, tugging with wild strength, helping to pull the boy into the open air. Caleb tumbled out, collapsing onto the dirt outside the mine, coughing violently but alive. Walter followed, crawling with his last reserves of strength. The daylight blinded him as he burst free, collapsing onto his back beside the boy. Above, the sky was still blue, impossibly calm, as though the earth hadn't tried to swallow them whole just moments earlier. The dog bounded over, licking Caleb's face, barking joyfully. Caleb laughed weakly through his tears, hugging the animal with trembling arms. "You saved us. You really saved us." Walter rolled onto his side, chest heaving, his body screaming with exhaustion. Daniel lay nearby, still unconscious but breathing, his chest rising steadily. Caleb clung to his brother, sobbing with relief. The veteran allowed himself a fleeting moment of satisfaction, but it was tempered by reality. They were out. Yes, but they were far from safe. Daniel needed medical care, Caleb could barely stand, and Walter himself was running on fumes. The nearest town was miles away, and they had no vehicle, no supplies, beyond what he carried in his pack. The dog nudged Walter's arm, whining softly, as if to remind him of the next step. The veteran sat up slowly, grimacing as pain lanced through his knee. He wiped the blood and grime from his hands on his torn shirt and looked at the two brothers. "All right, boys," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. "We're not dying here. We'll make it down the mountain. Together." Caleb looked up at him, eyes wide with trust. "We'll follow you, whatever it takes." Walter nodded, pushing himself to his feet. He hoisted Daniel once more across his shoulders, every muscle in his body protesting. Caleb leaned heavily on the dog for support, the animal steady and patient, guiding him like a trained rescuer. Step by step, they began the long descent down the mountain. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling, leaves rustling. But to Walter, every noise felt distant, drowned out by the pounding of his heart and the relentless voice in his mind. Keep moving. Don't stop. Don't fail them. For miles, that was all he knew. Pain, determination, and the weight of two young lives depending on him. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the ridges. Each shaft of sunlight felt like a promise that if he could endure just a little longer, salvation waited below. And though Walter had once walked battlefields half a world away, it was here, on this quiet Appalachian slope, with a loyal dog at his side and two brothers clinging to life, that he felt the truest measure of what it meant to fight, for hope, for survival, for one another. The path down the mountain was brutal. Uneven rocks jutted from the soil. Tree roots snared their feet, and every slope threatened to send them tumbling. Walter carried Daniel across his shoulders, the young man's limp weight pressing into his spine with every step. Caleb hobbled beside him, leaning heavily on the shepherd dog, who bore the burden with unwavering patience. The animal's ears twitched constantly, alert, as though guiding them with some instinct stronger than sight. Walter's breaths came in harsh, ragged bursts. His bad knee screamed with every downward step, and sweat trickled down his dirt-streaked face. But he did not slow. Soldiers learned long ago, when lives depend on you, pain is nothing more than background noise. Behind him, Caleb stumbled, nearly falling. Walter turned sharply, shifting Daniel's weight to one arm long enough to grab Caleb by the collar and steady him. "Stay upright, son," he barked, his tone firm but not unkind. "You go down. I can't carry both of you." Caleb panted, his face pale beneath the soot. I'll make it. Just don't leave us." Walter's jaw tightened. He didn't need to reply. His actions had already promised that. The forest canopy broke in places, sunlight spilling through, reminding them that safety was somewhere below. But the mountain wasn't finished with them yet. A low rumble rolled through the ground, at first subtle, then stronger. Walter froze. The trees around them trembled. Birds exploded into the air with panicked cries. A rock slide. "Down!" Walter roared. He threw himself over the brothers, shielding them as the shepherd barked wildly. Stones cascaded from the ridge above, crashing through branches, slamming into the ground around them with bone-shaking force. Dust and shards of rock stung his skin, but he held firm, his body covering theirs. When the thunder finally ceased, Walter lifted his head. The trail ahead was gone, buried under a wall of jagged boulders. The way forward had been cut off. Caleb's voice broke. "We're trapped." Walter climbed slowly to his feet, setting Daniel against a tree. He studied the rockfall, eyes scanning every crevice, every gap. His chest heaved, but his gaze hardened with resolve. No, there's always a way. He tested the edges of the slide. The rocks were unstable, shifting under his boots. Climbing over would be suicide with Daniel unconscious and Caleb injured. He turned, sweeping the forest with his eyes, until he spotted a faint deer trail weaving around the slope. It was narrower, more treacherous, but it might bypass the slide. "That way," Walter said, pointing. Caleb's eyes widened at the steep incline. "We'll never make it." Walter crouched in front of him, voice sharp with the steel of command. "Listen to me. You're going to dig deeper than you ever have. You'll lean on that dog. You'll crawl if you have to. But you will make it. Because your brother is counting on you. Understand?" Tears welled in Caleb's eyes, but he nodded. The shepherd nudged his side, as if agreeing, and Caleb reached down to grip the dog's fur. Walter hoisted Daniel again, grunting under the weight, and led the way onto the narrow path. It hugged the mountainside, a sheer drop yawning to their left. Every step demanded balance and focus. The dog went first, steady as stone, guiding Caleb with gentle pulls and pauses. Walter followed, each footfall measured, his arms straining to keep Daniel steady. One slip could send them all plunging into the ravine below. Halfway across, Caleb's injured leg buckled. He slipped, stones clattering into the abyss. Walter lunged, seizing the rope tied to the boy's waist. With a violent jerk, he hauled Caleb back onto the path. "Don't look down," Walter barked, his voice slicing through Caleb's panic. "Eyes on me, step by step. You can do this." The boy's breath came in ragged sobs, but he obeyed, clinging to the dog and inching forward. At last, the narrow trail widened, depositing them onto safer ground. Walter set Daniel down, collapsing to one knee, his muscles trembling. He closed his eyes briefly, sucking in the forest air, before forcing himself upright again. They pressed on, hour after hour, until at last, the faint glimmer of a dirt road appeared through the trees. Relief surged through Walter like fire in his veins. Civilization. Help. But the mountain was not done with them. As they stumbled onto the road, Walter heard it, the groan of shifting earth. He turned sharply. Behind them, the slope above the mine entrance gave way, the entire hillside collapsing in a deafening roar. Trees toppled, rocks thundered down, choking the sky with dust. The mine, everything was swallowed. Caleb stared, horror-stricken. If we'd been inside. Walter placed a steady hand on his shoulder. You weren't. That's all that matters. The shepherd barked once, sharp and triumphant, as if declaring victory. Moments later, the rumble of an engine echoed up the road. A rusted pickup truck appeared, driven by a farmer who slammed on the brakes at the sight of them. His eyes went wide. Good Lord, what happened to you folks? Walter didn't waste words. They need a hospital. Now. The farmer jumped out, helping lift Daniel into the truck bed, while Caleb clambered in with the dog's assistance. Walter hauled himself into the passenger seat, every bone in his body aching. As the truck roared down the mountain, Walter finally allowed himself to lean back, his vision blurring at the edges. The adrenaline that had carried him this far ebbed, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion. But through the haze, he caught sight of the brothers clinging to each other in the rearview mirror, alive. And beside them, the dog sat tall, eyes bright, ears pricked, as if standing guard over them all. Walter let out a slow breath. The mountain had tested them, tried to claim them. But together, man, brothers, and dog, they had endured. The ride down the mountain felt endless. The pickup truck rattled and bounced over potholes, the suspension squealing under the weight of its passengers. Walter sat rigid in the passenger seat, every muscle in his body aching. He kept his gaze fixed out the window, scanning the horizon as though still expecting danger. Old habits never died, but tonight, the only enemy left was time. In the truck bed, Caleb cradled his unconscious brother. The boy's face was streaked with coal dust, his lips pale, but his chest rose and fell with fragile persistence. Caleb whispered to him, voice trembling but steady. "Stay with me, Daniel. Don't you dare leave me now." Beside them, the shepherd sat like a sentinel, eyes glowing in the fading daylight, tail thumping once in reassurance whenever Caleb's voice broke. The farmer driving the truck glanced sideways at Walter. "Found him up there, did you? In the mine?" Walter gave a short nod. His throat was dry, words slow to form. "They were trapped. Dog wouldn't leave. Made me listen." The farmer whistled low. "Well, that mutt deserves a medal." Walter's lips curved faintly, though his eyes stayed sharp, fixed on the winding road. "He deserves more than that." The town hospital came into view as dusk began to settle over the ridges. The truck screeched to a halt under the emergency entrance, and nurses spilled out, rushing to the boys. Daniel was whisked away on a stretcher, Caleb limping after him, shouting his brother's name. Walter slid from the truck with difficulty, his bad knee nearly giving way beneath him. The dog stayed close, brushing against his side as though steadying him. Inside the hospital, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a harsh contrast to the soft glow of the mountain sun. Walter lowered himself into a waiting room chair, the vinyl squeaking beneath his weight. His body screamed for rest, but his mind refused to quiet. Images replayed over and over, the crushing walls, the groans of stone, Caleb's terrified eyes, Daniel's shallow breaths. He had carried men through worse, but somehow this felt heavier. Minutes bled into hours. Nurses passed by, glancing curiously at the grizzled veteran and the loyal dog sitting patiently at his feet. Walter scratched behind the animal's ears absent-mindedly. "Guess we'll see if they made it," he murmured. The shepherd pressed closer, as if answering. At last, Caleb emerged from the ward, leaning on crutches but smiling through exhaustion. Tears glistened in his eyes. "He's going to be okay. The doctors say he'll walk again. Broken bones, dehydration. But he's alive." Walter let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief loosened the knot in his chest. He nodded once. "Good. That's what matters." Caleb moved closer, voice thick with emotion. "We wouldn't have made it without you. You saved us." Walter shook his head, gesturing toward the dog. "Don't thank me. Thank him. He's the one who refused to give up." Caleb knelt, wrapping his arms around the shepherd's neck. The dog licked his face eagerly, tail wagging with pure joy. "Then he's our hero," Caleb whispered. Word of the rescue spread quickly through the small town. By morning, the local paper had already printed a story. Veteran and dog save. Brothers from collapsed mine. Strangers stopped Walter on the street, offering handshakes, thanks, even tears. But the veteran remained quiet, uncomfortable with the attention. He hadn't gone into that mine for recognition. He had gone because leaving them behind was unthinkable. Still, he could not deny the warmth in his chest, when he saw Caleb sitting at Daniel's bedside, both boys alive and smiling, their hands clasped together. The bond between them reminded Walter of something he thought he had lost long ago, the unbreakable tie of brotherhood. The hospital arranged a small ceremony days later. A crowd gathered, reporters snapping photographs, the mayor presenting Walter with a certificate of bravery. But Walter deflected the praise once again. He stepped aside, pulling the shepherd forward. "This," he said firmly, his voice carrying through the room, "is the real rescuer." I only followed his lead. The audience laughed softly, then erupted into applause. Caleb and Daniel clapped the loudest, their eyes shining with gratitude. The dog wagged his tail, ears pricked, basking in the attention. But to Walter, the animal's steady gaze told a deeper truth. Neither of them had done this for applause. They had done it because it was right. That night, when the ceremony was over and the crowds dispersed, Walter walked back through the quiet streets with the dog at his side. The air was cool, the stars sharp against the black sky. He stopped at the edge of town, staring up at the silhouette of the mountain. The mine was gone now, buried forever under tons of earth. But in his mind, he could still hear the echoes, the clang of metal, the cries for help, the frantic barking of a dog who would not abandon hope. Walter knelt, scratching the shepherd's fur. "We did good, partner," he murmured. Maybe that was the reason I was still here." The dog pressed against him, warm and alive, a reminder that even in the darkest places, light could be found. And as Walter rose, limping back toward the cabin he once thought was his prison, he realized the truth. He wasn't walking back alone anymore. The mountain had taken much, but it had also given something back. A renewed sense of purpose, 2 lives saved, and a bond between man and dog that would outlast any storm. And though the world might forget the details in time, those who were there would always remember. The dog that refused to leave, the veteran who crawled into the darkness, and the voices that were not silenced by the weight of the earth.